everyone, and welcome back to Catholic Family News. I'm Murray Rundus, the production manager and editor here for CFN, and I'm very happy to be joined by Serre Verweij. He is a Vatican analyst, and he's been producing some very interesting stuff. He's written for Rorate Celli before. He was seen on The Spectator, and we really wanted to have you on, Serre, because there's been a lot of talk, of course, about the upcoming conclave. And for our audience, of course, many of you already know, Pope Francis is still in critical condition, and it does seem to be worsening throughout the days. So our prayers are, of course, needed for the pontiff, but it is appropriate for Vatican media, Catholic media, to discuss really the state of the church and what the future conclave might look like, especially with how polarized the Catholic Church has become. And so really I wanted to start off, Serre. There's been this chart going around. It's kind of famous now. It's, you know, hundreds of thousands of views on X and everything. And there's been a lot of criticism, and many people have criticized the labels in particular of conservative versus liberal, moderately conservative, moderately liberal. Many traditionalists have critiqued, well, maybe conservative isn't the right word to use, because if you compare them to cardinals in the 1950s, they would be considered liberal. There's been some people who said that it's not a good representative of a overwhelming conservative cardinal. It doesn't seem like that's the case. I wanted to start off with your analysis. Where do you see the College of Cardinals being? Is it this overwhelming conservative majority, or what else are you seeing?
I'm glad you asked that. It's funny, that chart is actually based on my analysis, except for then altered by Pope Respecter. He created the distinction between the moderate and the more radical liberals, and it's one I disagree with, because there's more than 6 radically liberal cardinals. It's one area where we disagree. But as for the rest, the idea that it's basically a 2/3 majority of conservatives and moderates or moderate conservatives, yes, I am pretty certain that that is the current state of the College of Cardinals. So even if it's not overwhelmingly conservative, it's overwhelmingly conservative and moderate. I don't think that can really be disputed.
Yes, and I think there's been some people have critiqued, saying, well, you know, the conservative and liberal labels. I think, and maybe you share the perspective here, I think it's important that when we're looking at a conclave, when we're looking at a college of cardinals, we have to be realist and not have overabundant expectations. So in this case, conservative just means you know, generally following the church's teaching on a number of issues, and liberal, of course, means dissenting. Could you tell us, you know, when you were researching this, and you know, when this graph is put together, that's really looking into your research, when we make this label of conservative versus liberal, what are the factors you're saying to give them that term?
So when I thought of conservative, I primarily meant Ratzingerian, or however you pronounce that. So the tradition of John Paul II and Benedict XVI. So when traditionalists argue that that's still modern by 19th century standards, that's all fair. It's in the context of a current conclave. So if Tagle is the liberal candidate, and then people like, say, Muller or Burke, they're the conservative candidate, that's how conservative is defined. And so key issues are their stance on blessing gay unions, on sexual morality in general, the ordination of women, obviously openness to the ordination of women as priests gets them ranked way more liberal than women as deacons. That's a wrong stance, but you can actually have cardinals in the third world who are in favor of priestly celibacy and conservative on homosexuality and all that, but who are somehow support the ordination of women as deacons. So that's a bit odd. But so those factors, basically the hot button issues that were kind of shelved under John Paul II and Benedict XVI, and then came up again and again and again during every synod under Pope Francis. Yeah, those are basically the defining issues. So everything on which Hollerich wants to change church teachings, basically, and everything on which Mueller wants to preserve it, that's kind of the baseline. So it's not political. It's not about economics, about being a fiscal conservative. It's not about your view on the Iraq war. So it's not conservative the way Americans have known that term for many decades. It's conservative in the sense of the Anglicans who realized that blessing gay unions would destroy their church, and that archbishop of theirs who has now resigned in disgrace.
Exactly. I think it is important for us to be realist, and we have to be prudent when it comes to using terms, but in this case, I think it's fine. When we're talking about conservative and liberal, we're talking about two ends of the political spectrum. We're not making a judgment based on whether some of the Ratzingerian or John Paul II theological matters are absolutely correct. Of course, I have my critiques of them as well, but in this case, I think this axis is actually quite fair. So, you talked about your criticism of adding in this moderately liberal distinction. This is going to be a question I think that the next conclave will seem to hinge on. Where do you see the moderate sort of faltering on when we do talk about this moderate space? Is there a spectrum for what exactly they're disagreeing with the mainline conservative or mainline liberals on, or where do you see the moderates differing from the other two?
Yeah, that's interesting. For the most part, moderates differ from the conservatives in that they're either just less outspoken, or they tend to mix being doctrinally orthodox with being just very pastorally soft. You can ironically see that amongst certain groups of Asian cardinals, but also Latin American cardinals. I think a perfect example is there was an article by the New Daily Compass that mentioned a whole bunch of what they basically deemed to be rainbow cardinals who were allegedly LGBT friendly, even while being from the third world. But then when you look at all of the names they mentioned, aside from Cardinal Steiner from the Amazon, who really is a radical liberal, but aside from him, all of the other ones, Mafi from Tonga, Sergio Roja from Brazil, Pola from India, they basically had said nothing to deny church teachings on sexuality. And with some of them, you can actually look up and see that they defended it. But for example, Pola in India, for the last two Christmases in a row now, he has specifically provided Christmas presents to the local transgender community, not to the LGBT group as a whole, but just to transgenders. And he basically supports their quote unquote economic emancipation, because in a country like India, transgenders can actually often be dirt poor, and he supports them basically being given sewing machines so they can now do more honest work and get an economically better position. And then he also just, I think, allows photos to be taken of him with them for Christmas. And Mafi from Tonga had something similar, where he just met with the Lighties community, which pushes for LGBT rights, and he allowed himself to be photographed while meeting with them to celebrate dialogue. Yet at the same time, the Lighties community in Tonga has asked the church to support their call to repeal the anti-sodomy law, which still exists in Tonga. And even now that Pope Francis has come out against laws criminalizing homosexual practices, from what I've read, Mafi still hasn't endorsed that call. So he's willing to dialogue with them, but he's not actually going to call for the repeal of the anti-sodomy law. And I think about 10 years ago, when Tonga was considering signing some kind of UN document that could possibly support abortion or gay marriage, he spoke out against it just on those grounds alone. So that is what I would call a moderate cardinal. Objects to abortion, objects to gay marriage, but will basically have a dialogue meeting thing with an LGBT group and talk about being welcome and being inclusive, but not in the Martin sense, where it's clearly just to subvert doctrine and to really push a progressive change. So in that sense, honestly, most moderates seem closer to conservatives than to progressives, because they basically hold almost all, if not all, the same doctrinal views. They're just milder in applying them. And with third world cardinals, they don't necessarily have the same culture war context that would make such pastoral gestures look very ill-advised. I mean, meeting with transgenders doesn't look progressive in India the way it looks here. Homosexuality is becoming mainstreamed and liberal in India, but transgenders in Asia, it's like in Indonesia. The Archbishop of Jakarta has also told priests to be welcoming to transgenders, but that whole thing is illegal there. So that's just being pastoral. It's like it's like how the church gave asylum to criminals for hundreds of years. But so yeah, that's what I call a moderate cardinal.
No, it's very interesting, because I think it's not it shouldn't necessarily be seen as a defense of the moderate the moderate cardinals in general in their practice, but there is something very important here, which is that those moderates, it seems, at least to me, could swing either way when it comes to voting conservative or liberal. When you're viewing that, viewing this potential upcoming conclave, we don't know if it's going to be soon, or if it's going to be in the next coming 2 years. It wouldn't change that much. Do you see those moderates as being more susceptible to vote for a let's say a hardcore conservative like a Cardinal Sarah or a Cardinal Burke, are those moderates of a position where you think they even have the potential to vote for somebody who is sometimes considered even a traditionalist? Somebody might quibble with that term, but a more hardcore conservative. Do you see those moderates as being able to fall into line for somebody like that?
I see many of them as being able to fall in line for someone like that, yes. I see all of them being able to fall in line for a moderate conservative. So think someone like Arborelius, but also Erdo, cardinals like that. When it comes to a real hardcore traditionalist, someone like Sarah or Burke, Sarah a lot faster than Burke because there will be additional factors. For the moderates, for the third world cardinals, it will not just be about the doctrinal labels. It will also, I think, just be about the way somebody's character comes off, their likability, whether they come off as trustworthy, whether they come off as charismatic, but also how sympathetic they seem towards the periphery. Someone like Sarah, who is from Africa, will just have an easier time than Burke, who, well, he's an American right-winger. I think a moderate from India or from Tonga is less inclined to vote for an American right-winger than for an African conservative. So I think that will definitely also be a factor. But when it comes to the moderates, if I look at the College of Cardinals as such, I think about 60% of them can fall behind a firm traditionalist, and whether basically the additional 7% could be won over, I'm doubtful. They could be won over to a moderate conservative. I'm certain of that. So that is what I can say for now.
No, it's interesting talking about this additional factor of the peripheries. I think that's something that has taken some traditionalists and conservatives by surprise in a way, because some traditionalists, and I know this isn't even my instinct, view this Pope Francis pontificate as, well, goodness, he must have inevitably packed the College of Cardinals full of liberal-minded people like himself, or at least going to be on the moderately liberal side or even hardcore liberal side. I think, and we've seen that to some extent. I think in your analysis, you mentioned the 2016 appointments were much more liberal than the rest. But
yes, the case of Tobin.
Exactly. Yeah, so there's definitely been instances like this, but I think this has come to a surprise. Do you see that these more recent appointments, ever since 2016, has the focus been trying to pack the College of Cardinals with ideological friends, or has it been appointing people from geographic areas? What do you see? What was Pope Francis's focus in these last appointments?
Primarily the second part, the geographic areas part, although even there it seemed to lack a concrete strategy. For example, Pope Francis has been notorious for ironically naming very few Argentinian cardinal electors. He seemed to dislike his own fellow cardinals. He literally named only one in 2014, who was his successor as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Cardinal Poli. And then he didn't name any other Argentinians until suddenly in 2023 he added Fernandez, and he added Rossi as well. And then last year he added another Argentinian. So he suddenly flip-flopped on that. And similarly, he has named very few Latin American cardinals until last year, when he named, I think, like 5 or 6 of them. He also used to not name any Eastern European cardinals. Krajewski, the papal almoner, barely counts because he's just a Vatican worker at this point. And then in 2023 and 2024, he started to appoint a whole bunch of Eastern Europeans. Just one in 2023, but then last year he added a Ukrainian Catholic, a Lithuanian, a Serbian Hungarian. So there is a periphery strategy, but its focus shifts a lot from being very Asia-centered and mildly African to being almost anti-African because he named only one African last year, and from being anti-Eastern European to being inclusive of Eastern Europe. It's all over the place, but there is no ideological packing plan, not anymore. It's very evident that at least already in 2022, Pope Francis had basically soured on the progressives who were trying to hijack his synod, who were trying to make it about those hot button issues he said it wasn't about. And he soured on the Germans and their synodal path. And that only became worse when they started to push him, because the one thing that you should know with Pope Francis is that if he doesn't do what you want him to do and you then start pulling at him to do it more, he'll just become more oppositional. So it's telling Pope Francis hasn't named a single diocesan bishop in Germany, Switzerland, or Austria a cardinal ever. And he hasn't named the new Archbishop of Brussels in Belgium a cardinal either. Probably maybe even because of how the Belgians treated him when he visited their country. So yeah, no, there is no real pattern of ideological packing, not anymore. That's just completely over. And I think that's in part facilitated by the fact that Pope Francis's way of thinking is tied to his age. He's 88. Any cardinal he'll appoint will be over 10 years younger than him at this point. So it becomes increasingly harder for him to find someone truly like him, because Pope Francis isn't the kind of progressive who has a protege who's 20 or 30 years younger than him. There isn't someone like Pope Francis. His peculiar way of thinking doesn't have clear heirs or successors the way you have with German progressives or with Belgian progressives, or even with like people like Chupich and McElroy in the United States. It's so in a lot of ways he's isolated himself.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because I think it shows more and more that Pope Francis, Jorge Bergoglio, is not somebody that can really fall into a certain side as being this person is this kind of progressive. He is more of a, I would say, a personal pope, where much of his personal thoughts are being applied to this. His own personal experiences, and that lends to disastrous results at times, but it can also end with these paradoxical things. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, you said he does not have an ideological protege. So I think a lot of traditionalists, a lot of conservatives, at least it's been in the media, it's been in the mainstream narrative that, well, Cardinal Tagle, he is Francis 2.0. He is necessarily going to be, he is who the progressives are pushing to be Pope Francis's successor. Pope Francis seems to like him. Do you disagree with that assessment? Do you think Tagle's time has come and gone? Or where do you see him being? Do you see him being that protege, or absolutely not?
I see him as being one of the cardinal candidates who's most similar to Francis in terms of being perceived as liberal and having certain liberal views. But I don't think he's his protege in the sense that I don't think Francis likes him anymore. Francis basically de facto demoted him with the whole reform of the Curie thing and making him one of two secretaries for the now Dicastery of Evangelization. And whoever was behind that whole attack on him and his role in Caritas International, Francis did nothing to help him, to save him, or to salvage his reputation. So even if Francis wasn't behind that character assassination, which I'm not even saying it was entirely inaccurate, but the point was it was intended as a personal attack. Even the truth can be used that way. It was intended to ruin his reputation. And whatever the case was, Francis allowed it to happen. So Francis doesn't want him as his successor anymore for whatever reason. And his chances have decreased greatly because being viewed as a bad administrator, and even the tablet called him that, and that's telling. That's a liberal publication will basically say, he's a good man, but he's not a good administrator. The problem is, in 2013, they were looking for a good administrator, for an administrative reformer. Then we got Francis. Now I think they'll really be looking for a good administrator. With everything that's happened with the Vatican Bank and with Bessio, you can be viewed as a saint. Cardinals can believe that you might be performing miracles and therefore want you to perform a miracle on their behalf. If you're a bad administrator who won't be able to deal with Vatican Bank stuff, I don't think they'll be electing you.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think I think that's solid analysis. I think I've noticed over time, if you see some of the cardinal statements, there does seem to be a even if they're more liberal in tendency, they do seem to be getting tired of this pontificate when it comes to just its certain style. And I think an administrator is who they're going to look for next. I wanted to ask you about Pope Francis, and so we were taking for granted then that he has been prioritizing these geographic areas. Do you think his actions in something like Fiducia Supplicans or Amoris Laetitia that seem to have irritated the African cardinals greatly, the African episcopate greatly, and even the Eastern Europeans seem to have been very skeptical of that? Do you see those writings of Pope Francis, those decisions of Pope Francis, as having galvanized those groups? Do you think that those groups have become more conservative, and do you think they will be a part of, do you see them as a part of the conservative group now in the College of Cardinals where otherwise they might not have been?
Yes and yes. What's very telling is that the cardinal who ended up taking the leading role in opposing fiducious supplicants was Ambongo Bensumu, who was known as being one of the most centrist or even one of the most left-leaning African cardinals. And in fact, when I made my analysis, I put him amongst the centrists, and his actions during and also in the months after fiducious supplicants had me move him to the conservative category.
Mm.
And he always seemed like he was kind of speaking out of both sides of his mouth, that he was keeping his cards close to his chest. So whether he was a crypto conservative pretending to be a centrist or a real centrist who was just good at being on the good side with both groups, I don't know. But whatever was the case initially, he has become a real conservative now. Fiduciary supplicants seems to have radicalized him. And if Bensugu turns against fiduciary supplicants and if he turns against the progressive agenda, then all of the African cardinals basically are united against them, barring South Africa and the missionary cardinals in the north. They're not real African cardinals in a cultural sense.
Hmm. Yes, I see that as being the case as well. I think I don't necessarily think one can say it was a political mistake. I don't think Pope Francis really thinks of it in that sort of way. But I think it certainly has backfired for the progressives in general, Fiducia Supplicans in particular. Moving to Asia, because this is something I see in almost every analysis now. For example, if you go to the College of Cardinal reports or you see various analyses on this, you will see almost inevitably the talks on the Vatican-Chinese agreement will come into play here. And the Chinese agreement, it's very complicated. We've had Chinese people on the show, Chinese Catholics, that have discussed it. It's a nuanced topic. But what I wanted to ask you is, do you see that agreement and the relationship between the Vatican and China to be severely affecting the Asian mindset for the Asian cardinals? Are they really factoring that into play when it comes to voting for the next pontiff, or is that really an unnecessary factor to be considering when looking at these cardinals?
It may vary to some extent per cardinal, but some Asian cardinals are pretty close to other Asian cardinals, so then it will still end up affecting a lot of them. If you look at which cardinals have expressed themselves on the issue and how strongly they've expressed themselves on it, it's not just Cardinal Zen who has a firm stance on this. And it's interesting, for example, Bo from Burma, or we should say Myanmar now, obviously. He has expressed himself as a fanatical China critic for many years. And he has also been very close to Cardinal Zen. And it's not just him, but also the Cardinal Archbishop of Jakarta in Indonesia is very strongly anti-China. Both take a very different stance from Pope Francis on this issue. But what's interesting is that also cardinals added to the college more recently by Pope Francis have somewhat subtly, but still clearly expressed themselves critical of it. Go from Singapore was noted as clearly taking a different stance. But for example, Sebastian Francis from Malaysia was added in 2023. You should look at how he was interviewed by Crux Now on the deal with China, and that he was asked like, what do you think of it? Or what do Catholics in Malaysia think of it? And he basically just like then spends hundreds of words dodging the question and talking about how the Asian Bishop Conference organization is dealing with China and hopes to get closer ties with the church there. And then when he was asked to say something nice about the Vatican attempt to get a full embassy arrangement with China, he also again dodged the question. So there's many cardinals named by Pope Francis who don't have anything nice to say for the China deal. And Kikuchi now from Japan, who many view, I think, as a moderate liberal. I myself hesitantly have concluded he's in fact just a moderate. But Kikuchi spent an interview with NC Register having a lot of criticism about the state church in China too. So they consider it important enough to address it in interviews. They seemed quite concerned about it. But what's really interesting is that one cardinal who was again very concerned about China and who wanted it to be addressed in the document of the Amazon Synod was Ambongo Bensumu from Africa. And that's a relevant detail because that can contribute to an African conservative Asian axis in the next conclave. So,
do you necessarily see resistance to? Because I've noticed this too when you see it, like for example in the College of Cardinals report, resistance to the Chinese agreement has made somebody more conservative or considered more conservative. Do you see that as being a pretty standard factor? Is, well, if somebody is anti the Chinese agreement, they're necessarily going to be more conservative? Is that pretty much the case from what you've seen?
They're either going to be conservative or going to be moderate. I haven't seen a liberal who's like that. Chow from Hong Kong is the Jesuit who was named both a bishop and then quickly cardinal by Pope Francis, who's basically totally enabling China in its dealings, and he's at the same time in favor of women's ordination and all of the synodal stuff. So he's a clear progressive. With moderates, it can go either way, it seems. A bizarre example is Yu Heng-sik from South Korea. The current prefect of the dicastery of the clergy. He seems to be a pretty good moderate, and he's actually said some very conservative things about celibacy for priests, defending it last year when Skik Luna from Malta was suggesting it should be done away with so that clergy would no longer lead quote-unquote double lives. And yet, he actually defended the China deal in 2018. That's actually very bizarre. He expressed himself positively about it. Now, maybe he thinks differently of it now, but he hasn't really expressed himself as such. But Yu Heng-sik's views of communism and how to deal with communist regimes might in fact be his biggest drawback. He himself mentions in his autobiography that he was called the Red Bishop by some right-wingers in South Korea because of how he liked to participate in missions to North Korea to establish dialogue and all that. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that was a fair accusation, and it could be that he just brought it up because it kind of showed how polarized the situation was in South Korea. But it does raise the important question, where does dialogue end and collaboration or enabling of communist tyranny begin? And so it is a shame there. So moderate cardinals like Kikuchi or Yu Heng-sik, they can lean in either direction, but it will be at least one relevant factor. It might not be the decisive issue, but it will be one important issue. And it might be one of the most important to Asian cardinals, because Asian cardinals so far have largely stayed out of the big doctrinal debates. Fiducious supplicans was really important to Africans. It was also important to liberal Europeans, just in the other direction. Asian cardinals basically were just quiet. They sat that one out. So I think fiducious supplicans is like in the top 3 issues for African cardinals. And yeah, the China deal, if it's not in the top 3 issues of Asian cardinals, it's at least in the top 5. I can say that with relative certainty.
Yeah, and we're seeing then that it's very fascinating because even though we have this axis, there are so many things at play here. One other thing I think I've seen is there seems to be at least a sentiment, or this is in sort of just the collective consciousness of the West, that, well, look, the Italian cardinals are still somewhat, it's still a disproportionate number of the amount of Italian cardinals, and that's of course changed over time. But we haven't had an Italian pope in quite some time. Of course, John Paul II was was Polish. You had Ratzinger was a German, and now Francis is an Argentinian. Do you see that there might be a sort of whiplash back to going to an Italian cardinal? Do you think that that plays a role at all for some of those Italian cardinals maybe going back to finding an Italian, or even just finding a European? Do you think that's going to be a factor, or do you see that as being a negligible point?
I think that's basically negligible. I found it very strange when I first heard it. It was suggested that cardinals would want to return to normalcy, and I agree there, but therefore they would look to an Italian. And that's very questionable because, unfortunately, under Francis, look at people like Bessieux, look at a lot of the stuff that happened in the Vatican. It's not necessarily as if the church in Italy has represented itself as a bulwark of normalcy that defied Pope Francis. So that's one factor. Secondly, it honestly, to me, is strange that Vatican watchers seem to largely base themselves on sources in the Vatican to, it seems, second or third level curia people when it comes to estimating how a lot of cardinals who are from the peripheries and the other side of the world will vote in the next conclave. Additionally, it just seems strange to me that now that the percentage of Asian cardinals has risen from, I think it was 11% to 70%, that they would now somehow be concerned with suddenly returning to an Italian pope. That also seems very odd, especially in a time where the big world conflicts that are threatening countries in the third world would probably require a pope who might have a less Western-centric view of that, because Francis's views on these issues have sometimes been criticized as out of touch. But who's one person who had a big role in Francis's foreign policy? Cardinal Tagle. And that brings me to another important point. One of the clear Italian candidates would then be Parolin, but another one would be Zuppi. And there it gets even more complicated. Both are liberals, but Zuppi is more radically liberal than Parolin, even though Zuppi is ironically less disliked by traditionalists because he's not hostile to the Tridentine Mass. But on issues of homosexuality, he's openly supported James Martin's book, just for one thing. He allowed the blessing of a gay union about a year before Fiducia Supplicans. But the point is, Zuppi and Parolin are rivals, so it likely seems that there won't even be a united Italian bloc. They'll be split. They won't even have one candidate. And currently, there's only 17 Italian cardinal electors, 17. Their proportion within the College of Cardinals has dropped by about 40% under Pope Francis. So their influence compared to 2013, when we got the first Argentinian Pope, is 40% less. It's literally the lowest percentage of cardinals it's ever been in the history of the church, I think, at least for the last couple of centuries. If somebody's going to surprise me that it was majority French in the 14th century, well, okay. But yeah, so why periphery cardinals would suddenly want to help a diminished Italian bloc to get another Italian, to get someone like Parolin? That honestly doesn't make any sense to me, unless there's some kind of inside knowledge that's I'm not privy to. I don't see it at all. I think that's complete hogwash.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. I think that has something to do with just being outdated. I don't think some of the people watching the Vatican, I think they've done it in a haphazard way and really haven't examined the trends that we've seen with Pope Francis. And maybe we will end up with an Italian pope, but I don't think it will be because of those reasons. To sort of wrap this up, I want to look at sort of the best and the best case scenarios for each of the blocks. And I'd like to start with the traditionalist one. For someone whose main interest is the Latin Mass and is perhaps looking to potential regularization with the Society of St. Pius X, or is looking at repealing some of these things we saw with Fiducia Supplicans, as traditionalist as you can get, what is the best case scenario and most reasonable scenario? So what do you think the big hope is for the traditionalists when it comes to this College of Cardinals that is still reasonable among the potential, the potential candidates for Pope, the ones that are likely to become Pope? Where do you see the traditionalist hope being in?
Serre is the most a long shot, but I don't discount him entirely. But beyond that, I think they actually might have 4 or 5 choices. Raniev from Sri Lanka, Erdo from Hungary, Eijk from the Netherlands, Go from Singapore, and maybe even Arborelius from Sweden. So they have 5 significant choices there, all whom I think have a chance. I don't think Müller is even trying to become Pope, and him being German, ironically, I think would just be a drawback because they don't want another German Pope. But yeah, I think they have quite a few successful candidacies there.
Interesting. And going along with Mueller, do you also see Burke as being sort of out of the picture at this point?
Yeah, no, obviously. And I don't think he's trying to become Pope at all. I think he wants to be kingmaker. He doesn't himself want to be Pope. Nobody wants to make him Pope. He just wants to help restore tradition in the church.
Yeah, interesting. I think, okay, so looking at the progressives now, if you're a James Martin kind of Catholic wanting a successor to Francis that will go beyond that, who do you think they're looking to? Not somebody that necessarily has no chance, but who are they looking to continue the progressive vision? Maybe they can start a fire and get some of those moderate conservatives to rally around him. Who are those progressives looking to?
Zuppi, above all, I think. Really, Zuppi from Italy. More than Parolin, because Parolin, weirdly enough, has moved to the right on the social issues, on things like LGBT stuff, while remaining firmly against the Tridentine Mass and a firm progressive in many areas and supportive of the China deal. So Zuppi really would be the James Martin candidate. I mean, he supported the Italian translation of his book, so that should be telling. I think Zuppi more than Tagle, because Tagle has talked a lot about not using mean words about LGBT people and the divorced remarried, but Tagle has not necessarily been the person to call for blessing their unions, and honestly, he would be unpredictable in these areas. Would he be only a moderate liberal, or would he be as liberal as Francis, or more liberal? So I don't think they'd be going for Tagle. Zuppi, I think at this point has more appeal, more charisma. So I think he'll really be the primary candidate. They might want Greg from Malta, the secretary for the Synod, but Greg, for some reason, thought that moving away from what was perceived as a centrist position to being viewed as an ally of the German synodal path, for some reason he thought that was a winning strategy, when honestly the cardinals who firmly support that's like maybe 10 to 15 cardinals at most. He decided to basically alienate a supermajority of cardinals to win the loyalty of Reinhard Marx and Hollerich. So I don't think Greg has much of a chance anymore. So really, I think it's Zuppi, or possibly a moderate who might secretly be more progressive than he lets us know. Possible candidates for that, and I'm saying possible because I don't want to falsely accuse anyone, would be Stephen Brislin from South Africa, who might actually just be a real moderate. I think that's a significant possibility, but moderates can still be pulled in a wrong direction by bad advisors. So that's then your next best hope as a progressive. So Stephen Brislin, and possibly Aveline from Marseille, who wouldn't surprise me if he's actually also secretly more conservative. He is a friend of the Tridentine Mass, weirdly enough. And he was very fair towards that bishop who was retired earlier. He was ordered by Francis to investigate him, and he's actually done a lot to help protect him and to make that as smooth as possible. He's actually been very fair there, and he was even close to the bishop. So he was close to a very traditionalist bishop for a long time, for whatever reason, for whatever that's worth. But so I'm not sure about either of those. But so getting such a moderate and then manipulating them would be their next best hope. Ironically, I don't think they would want Yu Heng-sik as their moderate candidate, because Yu Heng-sik might be a big China enabler. I think Yu Heng-sik would probably be way too reliant on Perelin for foreign policy. That would be a big problem. But Yu Heng-sik, I don't think would be a progressive on social issues at all. So yeah, Zuppi, I think, really is their main hope. If they don't get Zuppi in, and they don't get Stephen Brislin in or Evelyn, then I don't see how they would really have a possible chance. Almost all of their stars have waned at this point.
Mm-hmm. And you know, I think you're completely right that if we do see a moderate, he will likely be drawn in one direction or another. I don't see him staying in the middle, and just because we live in such a polarized world in the church, in politics even, so it's going to be all around him. He'll probably be pulled one way or another. But concluding on this moderate note, on looking at these moderate cardinals, I think many people have placed Cardinal Pizzaballa as a potential moderate who has a chance, and many people are looking to him, of course, because of all these conflicts we have in the Middle East. Do you think he's the best, the most likely choice for a moderate, or do you see when you look at the moderates and you say, well, who is the most likely to become pope of the moderates? Who do you see just considering the moderates there?
I don't think Pizzaballa is necessarily the most likely. Honestly, I think that would still be Yu Heng-sik. The reason I have some doubts with Pizzaballa is, for one, I'm not sure he's a moderate. He's classified as a moderate because we don't know enough about his doctrinal views. But that complicates things. That means that he's not as much a moderate as an unknown, and that might make some cardinals hesitant to vote for him. He might even be a crypto-traditionalist. I don't entirely discount that possibility. But the issue is this. He's about 60, and by modern standards, that's very young. And after the pontificate of Francis turned out to be a lot longer than people had likely anticipated, and after Francis very stubbornly refused to resign, honestly, if a conclave is held within a month, I can actually still see Serre becoming pope just for the fact that he's due to turn 80 in June. And that might be a very likable thing to many cardinals, that at least he won't have like a 30-year pontificate. But with Pizzaballa, he's a man of about 60 and very good health. And his experience also is very limited to the Middle East. Pizzaballa hasn't weighed in on big Ukrainian topics, on China, on things like the International Monetary Fund, with which Cardinal Turkson has engaged, on themes of ecology, with which Asian and African cardinals has dealt. He hasn't even said a lot on any of the synods. So a man whose views are almost entirely limited to Middle Eastern politics, Middle Eastern ecumenics, and running a local church that's entirely outside of our culture war context here, but also in Africa, but then in the reverse direction. Yeah, I think he's very likable to many cardinals. But the question is whether cardinals basically want to do a gamble there, because it will basically be a gamble. It's kind of the Joker card.
Yeah, right. Well, goodness, this has been some fascinating analysis. I think anybody can really, you have everything you need here at this point. I think there's fascinating stuff here. If people wanted to see more work from you, Serre, where can they find you?
Well, amongst others, more articles on Raad Tagle. I'm mostly a Dutch columnist, so unless they can read Dutch, that might be, more complicated for them. But I might be branching out to other sites as well. So we'll just have to see about that.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for joining. And for our audience, you can see more analysis like this. We try to post things about the keeping up with the Vatican as much as we can here at Catholic Family News. So please do leave a like, a comment, and subscribe as well. And thanks so much, Serre, for joining us. And to our audience, may God grant you many joyful years.